All right, so back to the slides, we're talking about web services. All right. All right, so just a very quick recap. Okay, so I was giving you examples on what are web services, and to build a web service, the technical concept, the two most important things to understand is what kind of network protocols we use. I give a lot of examples about HTTP, and also how are we dealing with data. And JSON is the most commonly used kind of data, right? For HTTP protocol, it's a lot of things going on, but I just highlight one. You need to know request response, and then you need to know the syntax, and then the syntax includes things like a method. The syntax include how the URL has been specified. And also the syntax include how you're attaching the data using parameters or just push the data into the request body. All right, so show you some of the examples. And then for the response, then you will see the response status code and some of the headers as well as the response data. And depending on what kind of data you received, your browser might be able to render the HTML, JavaScript, CSS files, or it's maybe some other data that your app can, consume. And then at the end, I ask you, if you understand all of these concepts, how are you going to build this program? All right, building a web service application is very, very complicated because you will need to know how to use the thread pool to make a program that always runs, that always listens to activity that events through the network interfaces. You want to be able to handle the multiple requests at the same time in parallel. And then you want to be able to understand HTTP request, all the syntax and semantics. You want to be able to parse the data and then structure the data in the right format and then send HTTP responses, right? So this whole program, it has so many different things. And I think it will be kind of a good project to make if we're talking about like a senior project or some kind of owner project, for the whole like a 4-year study. Okay, so I think that will be an ideal project. But for this course, that's not really the goal. So that's why I told you we're going to use the web frameworks. So the frameworks means that we have this kind of a code already being written by some other developers, and they provide us all these common functionalities so that you do not have to rewrite all of the thread pool, HTTP request and response. We can just reuse that one. And then we only need to add our own logic for our application on top of this framework. Okay, so that's how this thing works. All right, so let's take a look at a very concrete example. Okay, a lot of you have the experience, and this is really simple. But for the ones who haven't worked on web services before, I think this one might serve a good example. Right. So here is one project I just loaded. All right, so this project is in the course folder right here. Okay, so I'll send out the link shortly. So this one is a web project demo project written in Java. I use Java Spring, and more specifically, we use a Java Spring Boot. Last time, one of you actually did mention about this project. It is a kind of a newer version of a framework that incorporates all the Java Spring components, just make the Java Spring even easier to use. All right, so I already checked out the project before the class. Okay, let me just run this project. All right, so here's the project. All right, so I'll go through the details a little bit later. And then, but basically the Java project, so you can see all this Java source files and the resources folder. I'll talk more about this one later. There's a folder for test. There is also this Maven POM file. Okay, so we'll talk more about what Maven is. All right, so for now, let me just open the code here. All right, so there is a app class. All right, so this app class here that has a main method. Okay, and also have two other methods. And this is a very simple and short method. Now you can actually find a lot of other stuff going on here. Okay, there's a web controller, a lot of code here. There's some kind of data provider, and some utilities. All right, so here is the code base. But without looking at too much of the code, let's actually run this application first. Okay, So the entrance of this program is right here, right? Because there is a main method, okay, right here. The main method doesn't do much, but let's just run it anyway. Okay, I'm gonna start to run this one here. Run the Java application. All right. So as you can see very quickly, and then it shows up this is Spring little logo here, and that's Java Spring. That's the framework we're using. And then a bunch of other information. You can see that it starts a server, initialize the ports with 8080 HTTP, start the service, Tomcat service, start serverless engine, all of the other stuff. Okay, eventually it says it started the app using 1.9 seconds on the JVM. All right, so now I have started this web service program or web server program. Okay, and then remember the very important thing I told you about this web service is this code should always be on. This program, once you start it, it shouldn't stop. Okay, if you just look at this main method, it just has one line of code that calls another function. And if it's a regular function, it just run that, right? But now you see, once I run this program, there is a stop button shows up here for you to terminate the program. And that actually means that this program is up and running. All right, so let's actually test it out. What does it mean? All right, so how can I see this web service is up and running, right? So I'm gonna go to my browser. I open a new tab. So this program right now runs locally, all right? So I am gonna type something called a localhost : all right? And then I wanna type a port number because it says that this service right now runs at its port 8080. Okay, so I'm gonna do a : 8080. All right, so that is the domain address for this server. Okay, so I'm gonna hit enter. All right, so it shows some little text here. It says demo project is running, but it failed to get a status. Right, so this little thing here you see is a web page. So we'll talk more about this one. But for now, at least shows that this page, the service is up and running because you can actually send out the request to the server and then get a response, right? So right here, you can see right now, if you look at this file here, you can't really see too much, but you might be wondering, what I can do with it, right? So I do have a couple pages that you can visit, right? So there is index.html, there is a home TV, home AJS, some of those. So let me actually see. Try to do like /home-ajs.html. All right, so you got this little, like a very simple plain HTML page with some tables and form and buttons for you to click and interact with, right? So this is a HTML file. You can see this is HTML, but it has this content. I'll talk more about this one later. But again, it shows that I have a server up and running, that I can go to here to visit the page and then load all the content. All right, so this one proves that this is a server program that already runs. But I really want you to see that how simple it is to do something like this, right? So right now you have this one line of code to start a server, and that's actually the only thing you will need. Okay, I do have a lot of other code, but if you don't need to do all of this user management, this is the example what is trying to do. You really don't need to worry about all the other methods. So in other words, to start a brand new web service in the production, or with all the thread pool, all the listener HTTP ready, you only need this one line of code in the main method in Java. That's it. And then you got this service up and running. As you can see, there's so many things going on here. I did not print any of those in my code, right? So you can't find anything here. You can't find anything in other classes. I'll take a look at some other classes later, but it has nothing to do with other code. So everything has already been done and implemented by Java Spring, right? So you might be wondering, so where is the Java Spring? So where is the magic, right? So obviously there are a bunch of code we are reusing, right? So where's the code? So this project is built on top of that. So we need to import and then get those dependencies. So the way we get it is we use a Maven file. So we'll talk more about what Maven is, but it is a build tool that helps you to manage the dependencies. For example, you open this one here, you can see that there's a tag called dependencies. Okay, we'll talk more about what Maven is in the future. You might not be able to read this one, but just to show you, this is the dependencies, and then there are different dependencies. Every dependency you got a name and you got a version to include. So that's why you have this one here, Spring Framework.boot, Spring Framework.boot, and then this one is a web, this one is a test. So these are the key major components for you to run this Java Spring program. And again, once you specify these dependencies, you will be able to see under here, there are the Maven dependencies. If you expand it, all right, as you can see, there's so many different jar files. Okay, a lot of jar files. Obviously, a lot of those are related with Java Spring Starter, and Spring Boot. As you can see, open Java Spring Boot. Let's take a look at here. There are maybe 30, 40 different packages. Every package, if you open it, there are a bunch of classes, right? Then you should be able to actually get all those classes. You open all the classes, you open the class here, right? Take a look at the other stuff going on. Every folder, there's so many classes. All right. Okay, so this is where the framework is. So all of these things doesn't come for free. And somebody already wrote all of these things. As you can see from the package names, some of these are related with security. Some of this one, something called Jackson, that's related with JSON parsing, serialization, something about properties, something about event, logs, configuration, annotation, as everything being written by somebody else. This is only one jar file. The Java Spring Framework has a lot of things. Here's auto configuration, all the code, starter, and then they also use some other dependencies, as I mentioned, Jackson, Tomcat. And if you look at Tomcat, there's probably more code. The Tomcat is a web container that runs everything, right? So and with this, you can actually open all the code. It's all open source, right? So like this guy here has thousands of lines of code, all right? So people already put so much efforts there to implement all this core functionality for web services. That's why now when we start to write our application, all you need is one line of code. It's called sprint application.run. And then you got this one, everything is done. All right, so this is really the benefits of using Java Spring Boot. As you can see, we're importing these things from the frameworks. We never wrote any of the code, okay? We didn't know how to write this one. Okay, but of course, if you're using Node.js, Express, if you're using Python Flask, Python Django, using Ruby on Rails, they all work the same way. Okay, so when you start to build your application, you're just following the framework and then write very little amount of code to get your application up and running. It's always like that. Okay, so any questions so far about this first impression, about the web service? No, so Maven is a build tool. Maven is equivalent to the package.json file or npm, a little bit similar to npm in Node.js, if that makes sense, Jimmy. Yeah. So we'll talk about the build tool. The build tool is a very important component for building like a software in a professional way. All right, good question. Any other questions? All right, so let's take a look at more about this web service, what it can do, right? So I want you to focus on one class, something called web controller, okay? So in Java Spring, this is the most important class, right? Now, this class actually expose all this HTTP request to the users, all right? So let's take a look at this class. It's a typical Java class, and they use a lot of these annotations, okay? We'll talk about annotation later. Basically, this annotation is also part of the Spring framework. That if you apply this annotation, like this one is called a REST controller, that means you are providing this class as a controller for the whole RESTful web service. We'll talk about a webful service, what that is. But it's a very typical standard for building a web service today. All right. And a lot of other annotations, auto words are really important. Okay, so we'll talk more about those in the near future. And then we'll talk more about this maybe in the 356 class. All right. And also here, let's go down to this method. Okay, let's take a look at some of those. All right. There is a method here in this class. All right, so this method here returns a string. The name of the method is called health check, and a bunch of comments, and eventually it returns a string. Okay, CS480 software engineering. Now I also want you to see this annotation here at the top, request mapping. The request mapping has a value, and here is some kind of a pass. The request mapping also has a method. It's called get. All right. So still remember what I told you last time, right? For any kind of HTTP request, you need to specify what kind of request method you're trying to use or you're trying to support. And in this case, I'm saying that if you're trying to visit this URL, please use HTTP GET. And that's the only thing I can accept. All right. So what does this mean? No, let's first check this URL. Okay. So this is a part of the path I can provide from my resource. Okay, so let's go back to the browser. I go to localhost /8080 or colon/8080 and then /CS4800 /ping. All right, and I hit this URL, immediately it returns this string here to me. All right, so I just showed you another kind of communication with my web service. I send out a request like this, I got a response. Okay, of course, I'm doing this in the browser. If you want to do it somewhere else, for example, I go to my terminal. I do curl, this one here, and I still get this result. Same thing. So this one proves that I am be able to talk to my web service. All right. So what happened here? All right, you visit this URL, and then why it shows up this one. Now, if you look at the code, everything is kind of self-explaining, right? So you type this URL called CS4800 /ping, and then you are sending this GET request. All right. So when that request get into this web server right here, and Java Spring is going to look for which method is going to handle this. All right. Since this annotation, this URL has been attached in this method here called health check. So this method will actually deal with that request. And then the way it handles the request is really simple. It simply returns the string back to the user. So that's why once you return the string, and then it will be wrapped into a HTTP response, and then it will be displayed right here in the result in the browser. Okay, so let's prove that. So I'm going to try something else. So for example, if I change this one to a different text, software engineering fall 2020, I change the text, I save my file, and let me close other files. Close files. All right, I change this one here, and then if I restart my code, oh, this is not a method to run. Here is the main method. So run my, anytime you change Java code, you have to rerun it, okay? So once this one starts, I go back to my browser. So same URL, if I try to visit it again, I hit enter, and you see this text got changed. All right. So that one just shows you how I actually program a little very simple HTTP request and response. Okay, and so once you specify the URL, you will have a method that maps to that URL and do the work. Okay, that's why this annotation here is called request mapping. Now, this is the annotation provided by Spring that allows you to map the HTTP request to the Java code. Okay, because essentially Java and HTTP, they're in two different worlds. They have nothing to do with each other. But now you want Java to help your HTTP request and response, then you use this annotation to kind of bridge them. All right, so that's how the web service works. Now, this kind of structure is really popular. Okay, really popular. I would say that Java Spring makes this kind of annotation and mapping. Later on, if you look at, for example, Python Flask, they use the same kind of structure. I think they use something called app route. If you look at JavaScript, Node.js Express, they also use the same approach. But the idea all comes from this Java Spring. All right. So since even though Java sounds like a little bit outdated, I would say, but don't underestimate, as I told you last time, don't underestimate the significance and the the power of Java. Okay, in my opinion, I have done a lot of web services in different language. I feel like Java's web service is really stable. It's super like safe, and it rarely crashes. If you ever write the Node.js server, you will know like sometimes the exception, all of those just crash your server very easily. But in Java, it's quite different. Okay, so most of the big companies actually still use Java. Like Amazon, I would say, previously I think 90% of web services are in Java. Now maybe it'll be changed, but it's not going to be too much. Google also use a lot of services in Java. Um, Not Facebook. Facebook used to have a lot of PHP. I don't know what they do today. And so Microsoft, obviously, they use their own C# and .NET. But Java, for sure, is a more widely used still. All right. Like I know people talking about Python more often today, but remember, Python is more popular in the data science, in AI, in those fields. I don't think Python is the popular choice for web services. Okay, the Python Flask is a very small scale. It's good for this course project, but I don't think it's good for production. And then Python Django is very popular, but I feel that one is very hard to use compared with other languages. Maybe that's a little bit biased because I'm more familiar with Java and other stuff. Okay, but that's just my opinion. So for web service for backend, Java is definitely a very like one of the top choices. Right, and also more importantly. The Java Spring has so many concepts that people build in. So a lot of newer web frameworks are still kind of using, and they're just making it a little bit more simpler. All right. Jimmy, what do you mean by discussing APIs? Right. So this is an API. Are you asking something specific? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it depends how you define the API. That could be one API, right? You try to return the status of the server, just something test, right? Yeah, I think I got the idea. So yeah, I think again, as I mentioned, these different functions and URLs are kind of the APIs. Okay. So it really depends on which level API you're looking for, right? So yeah, let's kind of talk more about this one later on. All right. So as you can see, I have another kind of a testing method here called CS4800/lottery. And then if you look at the code, it just generates a random number and then returns back a random number from, I think this one is from 0 to 99, not including 100, right? So let's test it out and then go back to my browser here. I do CS4800/lottery, all right, and hit enter. Lottery number is 6. All right. Again, the reason we got this result is because we type the URL mapped to this annotation, it delegates to this method. This method generates a random number and returns back to the user. All right. So that's why if every time I hit it, I try to refresh it, do it again, a different number, again, different number, I can keep doing this one here. Every time I'm going to see a different result. Okay. Right. So it looks like, if this is the first time you're dealing with web services, everything looks pretty new, right? So you're calling and seeing the result in the browser, but essentially it's still just your Java code. The only thing new being added here is this annotation that specified a specific HTTP path method. That's it. And for the actual logic, you're still doing things in Java. Right. And also be careful that if you do the wrong path, that's not going to work. So if I do a lot, okay, I hit this one here, I gave you an error. It says that this application has no explicit mapping for this one here. And also just because you're not finding this path, you're giving a path, and JavaScript didn't find all this path in this class. All right, so if that's the case, you're going to receive this not found error. Okay, so I do have a lot of other methods here in my code, but for now, you can have like a very first understanding about how the web service works. All right, for your project, once you select your web framework, you need to be able to you should learn how to write this kind of hello world example to get some of your HTTP API and requests working. And that gave you the foundation to do the next step. Yeah, Alex has a question about loading part of the page. Yeah, so loading part of the page, I think it's more of the front-end technology, or you're talking about like a refreshing part of the page. That one had nothing to do with the backend like APIs. So the HTTP request you define here, it just always gave you the same thing. I assume that you're asking how do you just load and refresh part of the page in the web page, right? Yeah, so that's more controlled by JavaScript. Okay, it's JavaScript, and then there was right now these days there's so many different technology you can do, and like React.js and Angularjs, they can all make that very, very simple. But this technology, right now is a very common technology. It's basically if you don't do that way, it's kind of strange. But back when I was in college, that was in 2003, 2004, it was not possible. Okay, one of the famous example that makes this work is actually Google Map. Okay, I showed you the Google Map example last time, right? So this one, now when you use this one, you just feel it's really natural, right? That's the way it should be. However, Google Map was a big innovation that they made this page dynamic. Okay, so for example, you got this page open here, and then you could actually go and zoom in, zoom out here, do all this update without affecting this part of the page, right? Or you can just type something here and then click on the result, and then it's just automatically, give you all the result real time without refreshing. In the old days, the websites are more look like this one. I have to say that this site is still kind of old-fashioned way that you type some of your query and then you click on a button and then it somehow reloads our page and then give you all this result, right? So this one, I don't think it's fully reloaded, but it's definitely, kind of a little bit old-fashioned, not to mention it's so slow right now. All right, so we'll talk about scalability. Our campus is not very good at dealing with this. Okay, yeah, I'm not criticizing their other stuff, but their scalability, definitely horrible. Like you guys probably had a similar experience that time you register the course, the Bronco Direct kind of crashes. All right, but anyway, so this is a more kind of old style page that you do something, it refresh the whole thing, but Google Map, around 2005, 2006, they started to do all the dynamic real-time refreshing. That was a really big deal. Okay, now the technology is really simple, but at that time, it's mainly done by JavaScript. All right, so I'll talk more about those. So GET requests can provide information for an entire page or a single piece of. Yes, so the GET request, I think I understand you guys' question. So the GET request, really, you control whatever you want to return. Like in this case, I just return a string, or I can return an HTML page. Okay, so let's actually show one example. I'm going to add one more. Okay, so let's try this one. So I'm going to return a string, and then this one here, I will try to do like a demo page. Okay, and then just as URL, I'll do a request mapping. Value here, CS4800/page. And then method request method get. All right. Now this time, instead of maybe have oh, I didn't return it. So this time I'm going to return a string with HTML page. Let's try that. Okay, so I'm going to just type something really simple, right? And then I can do a body here. right? And then we'll just do a h1 tag. I'll say that welcome. Maybe I can do another more visible like an image tag. Right? I can put an image. The image. Let's actually get a little image. Get an image address. All right, so something like this, okay? So very simple HTML page. I just write them in the same line. I don't want to deal with all the breaking the lines. So HTML tag and then body tag, I ignore the head tag and I got H1 heading, this one here, and I attach one image, loading this image from the source, okay? So that's a little code. So if I do this one here, let me rerun my code, stop and run it again. All right, so now go back to my browser here. I go CS480 and then page, hit enter. All right, now you see a page here, right? So very simple. There is a heading, there is a HTML, image, and limit links to a um, picture like provided from the CVP server. Okay, so what I'm trying to tell you is you can control whatever you want to show, right? In this case, I'm giving you a whole complete page. But you can also just give me a little like an image, only give me this one. And then you could have a JavaScript to call this URL in the middle of the page and just to fill in that image. That's also possible, right? So that's basically what my answer to some of your questions. The loading, refreshing partially or the full page is controlled by JavaScript. It's not controlled by the backend APIs right here. The backend API only helps you to decide what kind of content you want to return, but you know your front end controls how you want to refresh it, which part to reload. Yeah, I'll get you an example, Alec, later on. Okay, so it's done in JavaScript. I'll give you an example. So, all right. So let me see. Other questions? Yeah, we'll return JSON. I'll show you example as well. All right. Okay. All right. Good questions. Yeah, I'll get a little bit more examples. So from here, through this little three methods, I just want you to understand some of the concept I talked on Tuesday about what is HTTP and what does it mean, like a request method, the resource URL, and the data stuff, right? So the whole request and response. But you can see it's so easy to implement those. You don't really need to know anything about parsing, thread pool, listening, and understanding socket, all of this. So that's why programming at this level is a lot of fun because you just need to focus on your own application tier layer and then don't worry about the low level implementations. Okay, so JavaScript, that's very, very popular and powerful. All right, so let's try, yeah, you don't need to invert a binary tree, yeah. And then let's look at something else. So most of this URLs, like I showed you, just gave you something really simple, some of the text and everything, okay? And I do have another demo page here. I showed you home-AJS HTML, all right? So this is a little page that has a little bit more UI. Obviously, it's such a like a simple plain UI. But I made that for purpose. You know, number one, I don't have to spend too much time on installing. But number two, I think just giving this kind of plain, simple UI, it just makes everything simpler so that you can see the core part of this page, what exactly it is doing. Okay, so let's take a look at this page. So this is a front end. Okay, so this is a front end page. It is an HTML page, right? So let me open the HTML page right here, and it's found out the HTML page sits in this folder called resource. And then you go to the static, and there is something called home-AJS. All right, so if I open this one here, I'll try different editor, so that's easier to see. All right, computer got a little bit slow. Yeah, and also part of the purpose of showing this example today is to let you know, for those of you who haven't done anything on web service development before, this is really nothing hard, okay? It's still Java, as you can see. You just need to know this little extra concept about HTTP, request mapping. But I do admit that more work will be probably on the front end, okay? Some of the HTML stuff, JavaScript. All right, so I'm not sure what's going on here. Let me one more minute. All right, so this is the HTML code. I think this one probably is better. Okay, so this HTML page, typical HTML tag and head tag and title. You got a body here, and then all this division. These are the things content I just put here, the text, and down below here I got some table here, the table for the user, and then the table, and some kind of input here, right? So what this page is trying to do is show you a simple example on how you manage the users. For example, right now there's no user going on, right? So I can add a user. I can add a user about, I give ID, like student 001, give a name and a major, and I click on add. All right, so that user, as you can see, it shows up right here. And I can do another one. All right, I click on add, and that's another one. So pretty simple and easy to use. All right, it records the name, major, ID, and also the time you created. Right? You can query the user. I think it's by ID. If I do the ID, I can find the ID, find the user. You can also delete the user, right? So you can delete, right? And then you refresh, the user is still here. All right. So really simple page, but that actually does show you, I would say 70% of functionality you will need to build for your web service. How do you add data? How do you query search? And how do you delete? Right? Yeah, so I'll talk more about the backend here. I didn't use any database. I just used the files locally to save those. All right. But here is a front-end page that renders all of this. Okay, most of the data that you can see are just HTML. However, I do use some of the Angularjs, which I will need to talk a little bit more later in terms of how you actually send requests and response, all of those. Okay, all right. So, but this one actually does a little bit more things. But the way it works is that every time, like for example, let's talk about the ad. How the ad works is I type an ID, I give a name, right? And I give a major, right? The moment I click on add button, this is the front end, it sends a request to my server, and then to send this data to my server and to want to add it. All right, so I can first show you that method, how that works. Okay, so if you go down, if you can find something called a get user, update user. So this one, as you can see, it is a post request, because I told you I'm trying to change something, modify the content on the server side, so the post request works more like it's more meaningful. Now the URL is looks like this. So CS4800/user/a user ID you are trying to add or update. Okay, the user ID is the unique ID for this specific data, and together you also need to send me the name of this user and also the major of this user. All right, once you send it, it gets to this Java code. Now this part you can easily understand. So here's the user class. I create a class object, and I set the ID, set the major, set the name, and I call another user manager to update the user. All right. Now, first of all, let's take a look at what the user is. So I'm going to open this class right here. All right. So this user, pretty much the simplest class you can ever have. 4 attributes, just getter and setters, nothing really special. Okay, very simple data class. So you create an object and set all the attributes. What's happening here with the user manager? So let's take a look at what is user manager. Oh, user manager is a class called user manager. I open it, And it turned out that user manager is a interface, so it doesn't really implement anything. It gives you all this methods. You can get user, update user, you can delete user, right? And you can also list all the users. All right, so where is the implementation? You should be able to find it from here, maybe. There's something called FS User Manager. I'll open this one. So this one is called a file-based, file system-based user manager. So that's why I didn't use any database just to make this program really simple. I use a very simple file to save and serialize all the content. All right, so I actually save everything into JSON. All right, so this one here uses a JSON object mapper that translate object to JSON or parse JSON back to object. But anyway, let's take a look at that method, something called update user, this one here. This is the one we just called. So if you have this new user, you're sending it here, what it does is it tries to get a user map and then put this new user into this map. So I'm actually using a hash table, a hash map here to save all the user data. Okay, ID and object, ID object. Eventually, I persist this user map. Persist means I save this user map into the local file. All right, so let's take a look at the persist first. The persist basically, it writes this map object into the local file. Where is the file? You can find get user file from this method here. It actually goes to my base directory. There's something called user map.json. So we can find that later. Okay, that's how I use a file system to save everything, to save all the data. All right, now go back to this class here. That's how you do the persist. And then you can also do, like in the beginning, you actually get this map first. Where did the map come from? It also comes from the file. So it locates the file first, check if the file exists, right? So if that file exists, I'm going to read all the values and then load that into a user map. And the user map will be returned. So what is the user map? And if you open this class here, it's just a hash map. It doesn't do anything. It's just a hash map. I rename it so that it makes more sense for this application. Right. So all I'm trying to show here is a use a file system to load all the data. So where is the file? I think it should sit somewhere in the root folder, right? So I go to here, CS480. Here's the file. And then if you want to take a look at the file inside, that's it. All right. So that's the content. Everything is inside the file. It's just a JSON data. Now I only have one student, right? So if I try to add more, okay, I'm going to add one more. Okay, so go back here. If I reload this file, and there are 2 records. Okay, so this file is just my database that saves everything. All right. Okay, so guys, so don't worry about this part of the code. I went really fast. I don't expect you to get all this little logic, but I give this a code to you, then you can probably read and understand it right away. But I want you to focus on this part here. Okay, so it's the API, it's the HTTP request. So this time what happens is you have this new API that allows you to add a new user by providing an ID, by providing this extra parameter with HTTP post request, and then that is going to trigger all this backend code here to save everything into the local database. All right. Logically, this part works exactly the same way as these things here. The only difference, this one only gives you a string, where this one does a little bit more work. Okay, so if you understand this one, if you see there is a delete, this is how you delete a user. There is a list, how you list all the user. And there is also something called a get, how do you get an individual user. So they all work the same way. Everyone has a URL and to use, and then you can see the method and how you operate, how you communicate, interact with the backend. All right, so let me show you more examples. Let's see here, there is a users list. Let's see what this one does. I go to my server, okay, localhost 8080 /CS480 /users /list. So I'll do this one here. Now, as you can see, this time it gave me this JSON data. All right, why? Because this path maps to this URL right here. And then this one is going to load all the users from the database from my file and return that as a list. and then Java Spring will turn that list into a JSON format. And then that's what you see here. All right. So, but then anyway, this HTTP request just works in the same way as the simple one I showed you earlier about the ping, about the random number lottery, all of those. All right. So, however, how does this one work with the HTML page, right? So you got a front-end page here ready. That's what you see here. You got your backend ready. That's what you see here. But how can we make sure that you click on the button, it calls this function to add? Or how can you make sure you refresh the page, it calls the other function to load all the users? Obviously, this table comes from this URL I just showed you, right? So URL is here, you can get all that JSON, but how can I display that in the table? Okay, that's when JavaScript comes into place, right? The HTML page is just a static page content here. It doesn't change. And then your web service can give you the data, but the web service doesn't know how to manipulate your JavaScript, your HTML. So you need somebody else in between that communicates and then translate the data into the front-end page, and then receive all the front-end interaction and input and give it to the backend. Okay, it's all done by JavaScript. So JavaScript is a kind of glue that connects every component. Now, this page here, the demo page I gave you, use a very special JavaScript. It's called Angularjs. It's still kind of a JavaScript, but it's a very popular one, more than kind of a JavaScript that does all of these things really easy and simple. Okay, so let's take a look at one example here. For example, here called add user, like this one here. Let's see what happens. So for the add user, it's this button right here. Okay, so you type some key ID, name, and major. You click on the button. And then this is where the button is. Okay, as you can see, this button, once you click, it has a function called add a user. Okay, so where is that function? That is a JavaScript function. And then you need to find out that function. Okay, this file uses a JavaScript file. You can find from here, right here, from the head. You can see that should use this home control ajs.js this file. Okay, so I'm opening this file right now. Let's find it. It's actually under this JavaScript folder. There's a home control AJS. Double click on this one here. All right. So this is that JavaScript file. But again, this is not a typical JavaScript. This is Angularjs. If you use React.js, it just looks a little bit more different. But if you use regular JavaScript, it's also in this kind of syntax. But again, there are different pieces. So we're trying to call this function called add user. Okay, now this is what happens. When you call add user, it is a function. Now what's it gonna do is to send a HTTP post request, and then to this URL, CS4800/user, and then it's trying to get this ID. Okay, where does the ID come from? The ID comes from your input box. Okay, let me show you that page here. All right. So when you type this new ID and name and major, as you can see, every input box has a model ID. This is called new ID, this is called new name, and this is called new major, right? So once you have this ID here, and the JavaScript will be able to load those things. /user plus that ID, and then question mark. That's how I pass the parameters. Name equals to name, major equals to major, right? So I'm using this one to form a URL, and I send that through a HTTP post request, right? So that's a function of JavaScript. So JavaScript can make that call to the web service. And once the result is received successfully, and then it will actually call this function called load users. What does load users? So load users is just right here to call another function to list all the users and then send those data back to the users. So you will see that every time when you add something new, this table here will be refreshed. Let me try it again. So student 006 name, add. So when that is successful, it reload all the user, call the API to get all the users, and then it will automatically refresh this part of the page. This one kind of briefly answers the other question about how do you partially load the page. In Angularjs, it's really simple because you see here, there were two tables, right? At the top, this table just lists all the users. All you're saying is that I'm trying to load all the users from the backend. So whenever there's a change in the users object, it will trigger the updates for the table. Okay, so this part here, the refresh is a partial refresh. It's not a full page reload. It's only get this part of data updated. So this is a very modern technology to do this. In React.js, you also have your way, a different way to do it. Or if you just use regular JavaScript or jQuery, you can also do a similar kind of effect. All right. So guys, what I'm trying to show you here is that behind the HTML page, the front end, JavaScript is really important because JavaScript allows you to send the request, trigger all the HTTP stuff, and interact with the web services. And then JavaScript also helps you to say if I get the result from web service, what do I do to show right here? Okay, now obviously I know this is like a very quick high level overview. And then we could go a little bit deeper into this web pages. But I think the best way to understand all of this is kind of take a look at this sample application, try to run it yourself, make some changes, and try to understand the key major component. This whole front end only has two files, HTML file and then the JavaScript file right here. They work together. It's really self-explaining a lot of different things. As you can see, I try to keep this file really simple and concise so that you can easily get this idea. All right. So now hopefully you got a better feeling about what the project is about. Okay, the project is about building this web service program that has all this HTTP APIs and HTTP paths. It may have a database or it may not. I would recommend you actually use the database, but more work will be on the front end, and you need to build what your page looks like in HTML, and then more importantly, how you're going to use JavaScript to connect your HTML with the backend so that the user can start to use this UI and user can start to interact with your web service. All right, any questions? Yeah, the Dakota's question, how do you keep the server running on errors? So it depends on what kind of errors it is. There are different type of errors. For Java, I'm very familiar with it. So if your error has a, the good thing about Java Spring is that I think the regular exception is not going to do break and terminate your server. That's the thing I really like about JavaScript. But you know, it's good and bad. But sometimes you're not aware of their exception going on. But you know, just because your server still looks like it's running. Where Node.js, any kind of a minor exception is going to queue and terminate the server. So that's the part I really don't like sometimes. And but that's also good that for you to help the errors, right, find errors right away. But yeah, so for Java Spring, I think regular exceptions, it will be thrown there. If you catch that and handle that, that's good. Otherwise, it's okay. It's not going to crash your server. But sometimes the error is more significant. For example, you're running out of memory, there's a memory leak, and that's going to terminate your server as well. So it depends on what kind of error you're dealing with. Right? But no matter what, in Java, most error you will see that's through exception, right? Yeah, so these are some of the things I want to show you. But then the basic idea is that um, yeah, some of the things are, this is a technology I mentioned called Ajax. Ajax is a kind of a JavaScript library that does all the HTTP requests. This was the first technology that supports kind of a easy way to call and refresh things in JavaScript in web pages. And nowadays, it still use Ajax, but it's just hidden in the libraries. For example, the Angularjs, the library is easier to use. Now you got all this HTTP calls just like this, really simple and easy, that you specify the URL and path, and then it will just do all the work, right? All right, so that's a very quick go through of the demo project using Java Spring. But again, to summarize, what a project eventually will look like, or in other words, what are you going to build, right? So number one, you need to have your code base for your web service, no matter whether it's in Java, Python, JavaScript, or other languages. And then you need to have a database. I didn't show you that part. I have a very simple file-based database. And then you can use this one, but I highly recommend you set up something else, MongoDB, MySQL, all of this works. Okay, it's kind of a good thing to learn and put on your resume. And then the third part is to work on the front end. Okay, you will need to know how to write HTML. You will need to know how to write JavaScript. And also, of course, you need to deal with the CSS, the styles, how the page will look better. Okay, that's basically your project. Your project could just be one folder with all of this together. But obviously, there's just a lot of things to learn, especially on the front-end part. I think there's a lot of things to learn. So if you have a team, I mean, it's kind of good to split the team into back-end and front-end. I might put a little bit more efforts on the front-end because in general, the front-end probably costs more efforts. Right? Because for back-end, if you understand the framework, just using the language you're familiar with, I think you can get the things done very quickly. All right, any questions? Yeah, the MongoDB and NoSQL database definitely is easier to use and easier to set up, and that's why it's getting popular. But yeah, again, the difference between NoSQL database and the SQL database is also another big topic. I don't think either one can replace the other one, but the trend obviously is we use more and more the NoSQL database, such as MongoDB. MongoDB had this MLab that we also use sometimes. So this one here. This one provides the database hosting for free in the initial level. I think the company is now acquired, by MongoDB. Yeah, so pretty successful startup. Right. And also, I'm just showing you the Angularjs. I didn't mean that you use Angularjs. You can use React.js. You can use there are a lot of other things like Vue.js. I think that's another one. Vue.js, yeah, that's another one. And this one I heard is even simpler to use. It's definitely very popular. But all of this needs some time to learn. Okay, I think this one might have a smaller learning curve than the other two. But React.js and Angular.js, you definitely want to learn something in the beginning. I hate the learning curve in the beginning. It takes a little bit of time. But once you understand it, then it's really powerful. Like all this, I showed you all this refresh and data update is really easy to work with. All right. So let me actually also send you this link. This is a demo page I use. Sorry, demo project I just showed you in Java. Okay, if you want to use Java, this is probably a good starter. And then it used Java Spring Boot project. Last time some of you mentioned about that one. All right, so this is definitely very popular to use. All right, any other questions? And just a little bit more words on the project base. So for our course, the project is most important. And I try to, use a kind of project way for the coursework for most of my classes. The reason is very simple, because these topics are like, senior levels, super practical. And all of this, if we do a lot of exams, I really don't see the point, right? So you remember some of the concept, that's fine. You know what HTTP is, you know what the method is, but so what? Can you write a little function to do a web service? I can't tell that if you just answer that on a piece of paper in the exam. So we like to see your live project or working project. All right, so I like to use a project that fits really better for some of these higher level courses and practical topics. Now, when you are working on a project, I kind of explain my point in some of the mobile class as well. I want you to think a little bit bigger. Okay, the course project. Now you have done a lot of course project before at different levels at different courses, even before college. You know what a course project is. In fact, some of you actually put a course project on your resume. Okay, I won't say it's a very significant piece on a resume, but it's better than nothing, right? And so at least it shows you some kind of a technical things. So the question here is, can you think bigger and to make the course project more significant? Because in general, if you put a course project on resume, okay, from the employer point of view, and it's okay, it's just something that you put there. It's not going to be so unique and special no matter what kind of project it is, how much effort you spend, because people can't really evaluate that very easily, right? So I have to tell you that most of the company employer won't take that course project on a resume seriously, because everyone has done a college and everyone know what the course project is, right? So it's just a part of the course work. You finish it, that doesn't mean anything. At least it doesn't mean anything like a practical or at the professional level, right? So the question is, how can we improve the impact of this course project? Now we're still doing a course project. This is not really a different type of project. So how can we make it different? So I think I got this answer a few years ago when I was working on a startup company. Now remember I told you about this mobile AR company, right? So let me find the slides. So we got this very cool technology here. And let me find this one here. About that mobile AR, I showed you the demo, like take a picture thing and then you can recognize the object, right? And then let me find that slides. So a bunch of computer vision techniques. It's actually this one right here. This one. Okay. So this algorithm here, okay, it's mostly based on computer vision. Okay, it does all this capture the images. After that, you extract the features, and then you match all the features on different photos, and eventually you form a 3D, I call point model. So this is the core technology of this startup. Okay, computer vision technique. So at that time, I didn't write most of the algorithm. It was done by a PhD student in Virginia Tech, and a very smart guy. So he wrote most of this algorithm, but he was still a student, right? You might wonder why, how did he come with this idea? Well, he didn't come with this idea because he's a writer. That's his research topic. That was his PhD research topic to finish for his PhD degree. His topic is about this 2D to 3D, like a point cloud model construction, some of this, I don't know what about the term. Okay, so this is his schoolwork. Okay, however, the schoolwork, got a little bit bigger impact and it turned out to be a startup, right? So at that time, I was really impressed by this student. I wasn't really talking about how smart he is, how good his coding is. I think I can do the same kind of coding, no problem. I feel that this student, did such a practical work that it already goes beyond his coursework or school's work. Okay, even though this one still is the thing he need to finish as a PhD student to graduate, but the value, the impact already goes much more than that. So for example, he had this startup company, okay, as a student, and then he's not spending extra time to build another company. No, this is a project he's doing every day already, and now he's just getting a lot more extra, a lot more good potential. Even though this startup didn't work out, but he is definitely experiencing something not typical in the grad school by most of the students. And another good thing about this thing, at the end of the like after he graduated back in 2014 or 15, he actually joined Apple, or as a software engineer, and then he still works in Apple today. And also at that time, the reason he joined Apple was simply because he joined this. At that time, it was a secret team. Right now, it's not a secret team. He joined Apple's AR team, okay, to do the augmented reality. And I don't know how many AR features you've been using from iPhone, but a lot of things coming from his team. All right. And at that time, not many people were working on AR. And this project was, even today, still kind of advanced. And then all of this experience he gained, easily sent him to Apple. All right. So I don't know if you get my point. Now for this guy, this student, okay, he was working on this course project or school project, which he's supposed to finish. That's his duty. And then he finishes that one, he fulfilled and satisfies the requirement to graduate. But at the same time, he had a startup built on top of this one. Also, at the same time, this experience gives him a lot of advantages for his job application and career. Okay. And I suddenly realized this is such a good choice of working on a course project or a student project. Because when I went back and think about the project I did for my PhD, I also spent a lot of effort, also spent a lot of time, right? I built a lot of software model technologies, code generation, all of those. But I realized that that impact is so limited. Okay, we got some of the practical application, but it was a very, very initial and early stage, and we didn't push hard. It only satisfied my graduation requirements. So I had a very good PhD study. I graduated actually very quickly, faster than most others. But my work was only, limited to my PhD work. It didn't turn out to be any other kind of extra things. And for my job application, it's all about algorithms. It had nothing to do with my PhD work, right? So, well, that is still okay. But, if you can improve the value of your time by getting something extra, why not, right? So since then, well, after I joined Cal Poly Pomon, I often tell our students, like same thing to you guys here, okay? Working on a course project is such a simple and common thing for you, but you need to really start to think a little bit bigger, okay? If you only just think about this as something you need to finish your homework and exam and get this thing passed, that's okay, but the bar is just a little bit too low, okay? But if you can actually make it also very, very practical, hopefully have a potential to be a startup, why not? If you can use some of the cool technology that actually enrich your skill set and then put something extra on your resume that might help your job application, why not, right? So, but we're not really asking you to do 2 or 3 more things, right? So you are still spending the same amount of time working on the same project. The only thing you need to think about is to scope this project well, and then so that it can help you to reach more goals. Okay, so it's just about the decision, a plan, a goal. Of course, execution is more important, but I want you in the beginning to not just think about this one as a regular course project. Okay, think about that as your personal startup project. And when you work on this later on, I will try to make sure that you guys can publish this project with a real domain name so that you can put on your resume. When people see this course project, they will realize that this is something more special and more professional. Or maybe one day you just make a startup based on this one, who knows, right? So that's kind of my expectation. I think I talked about the same thing in mobile class as well. Hopefully you got the idea, right? Same thing, you made the app and then go ahead and publish it and make it practical and see what happens. Of course, most of our project didn't turn out to be a successful startup. That's expected, but there's nothing wrong of having that kind of requirements, and because that at least gave you the opportunity and chances. All right, so that's my expectation on the project. So definitely take it seriously. I'm not saying you spend a lot of extra time. You just need to look bigger, think bigger, and raise the bar a little bit. All right, so that's all I'm trying to share today, guys. Definitely start to kind of follow some tutorials and be familiar with the web framework you choose, and also the front-end web development stuff. Okay, you will learn so much, but trust me, as I told you last time, no matter how much experience you have, you will be able to finish a project. I haven't seen any kind of exception in the past years. Okay, it's a lot of fun to learn all of these technologies, very like modern technology. All right, so that's all for today.